Hi everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. This is Ms. Mokwa with another one of our audio lectures from Wellington Community High School for AS Level Psychology, Syllabus 9990. We're going to be moving on today to study number 2 within the learning unit. This study is called Saavedra and Silverman, or Saavedra and Silverman. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it. It's going to be a short study, so it's not going to be as long as our previous from Bandura. Significantly shorter, a little bit more straightforward. We're going to be doing some extra activities here about things like conditioning. So make yourself comfortable if you want to grab some notes. If you want to grab some notes or anything from your PowerPoint, anything you'd like to add, please take that out now and make sure you're ready to go. And we're going to move on. Just as an FYI, if you hear any little scuttling noises or anything moving back and forth, that's just because I'm recording in my study and I have the cats in here with me. So if you tend to hear a little bit of a meow or you hear something funny, it's just because I have the cats in here with me. Okay, so introduction. We talked a little bit about this in class, the idea that we all have fears. So we all have things that we're afraid of. For example, I have a pretty significant fear of snakes. I absolutely hate them. They've always made me incredibly uncomfortable. Ever since I was little, snakes just really freaked me out. Now, the difference between a fear and a phobia is really important, and we should highlight that here. I may have a fear of snakes, but I could still, for example, see a snake at the zoo, or walk by a snake in the park, or I could watch an Indiana Jones movie because, there's snakes in those kind of movies, but it's not going to bother me too much. Now, if you think about a phobia, phobias are much more severe, they're much more intense, and the big thing here is that they really interfere with everyday life and functioning. The fear is persistent, it's irrational, and the person has to actively go out of their way to avoid that stimuli. So just keep in mind here that a phobia, it can be an animal like a snake or a spider, it can be a situation like fear of heights, it can be an activity like fear of getting shots or fear of needles. So there's all different kinds of phobias. It doesn't just have to be one kind or one sort, but all of them usually have this really, really irrational, deep-rooted, specific point of view, and it is significantly different from a fear. So make sure at this point you can distinguish a fear and a phobia. Now, every study, as we said, is going to have a purpose or an aim. This study is going to be looking into conditioning, classical conditioning and disgust. So classical conditioning and operant conditioning, we're going to cover both of those in this PowerPoint. If you've heard of Ian Pavlov, he did the very famous study with the dogs who salivate at the sound of a bell with the meat. So we're going to go over that as well. And that's going to relate to the specific case study of this study. It's a young boy who has a phobia of buttons. As surprising and weird as that might be, his phobia of buttons is real. It's incredibly severe to the point where he can't even, for example, go to a craft store where they have all the buttons in the aisle, or he can't even button his shirt before school every morning. So this is a real thing. It's uncommon. This button phobia is very uncommon, but it is a real thing, and that's the case study we're going to be building off of here. Now, for the aim, make sure to memorize the main points of this. You don't have to do it word for word, but just make sure you have the main points. And I just realized I had a typo there. It says to see if exposure therapy could reduce, it should be could reduce. So could reduce the disgust and distress associated with buttons. Just a heads up there. So talking about background, that's a cute little photo I wanted to use of Pavlov and the dogs. We're going to learn about two different kinds of conditioning here. The first one is classical conditioning, and then we have operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is based on the work of Ian Pavlov, training dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell when they pair the idea of the bell with being fed. So naturally, dogs salivate on their own. We don't have to make them salivate. That's why this is classical conditioning. It's about a natural human or animal response. So, for example, if your shower at home, let's say it always runs super hot when it starts, and you've learned to jump back in the shower and avoid the hot water because it's painful, that's classical conditioning because it's about a natural human response to pain. It's not about something you value, like a reward or a punishment. Like a reward, for example, Operant conditioning would be like if you got good grades and your parents decided to take you out to dinner or give you a gift card. That would be operant conditioning because you've assigned some kind of value to the item you're receiving. Whereas classical conditioning, which is the root of this study, is not about that. This is about natural human responses. So at this point, we're going to watch some videos, and if you guys would complete that worksheet, we're going to work on the classical conditioning worksheet together in class. Just to note, this will be for an assignment grade, so please keep that in mind. This is an assignment. It is part of the chapter, and it is required. Moving on here to slide number 6. Okay, so a little bit more background. Looking at the study, looking at Saavedra and Silverman, some psychologists believe phobias can be learned. So the good thing here is if they can be learned, they can also be unlearned. If they can be programmed, they can be unprogrammed. So the idea here is we're going to look into expectancy learning. Now, expectancy learning is when a previous neutral object or event becomes associated with a potentially threatening outcome. So let's think of it this way, giving you a bit of a serious example. Let's say that you're in a home situation where abuse is common. Unfortunate physical abuse is part of your daily life. So let's say the person who is doing the abuse, let's say that's your father, okay? So the father, every time your father comes home, you hear the garage door go up. So every time he comes home angry and upset, and physical abuse occurs. So then after a while, you would associate the physical abuse with the sound of the garage door opening because you're going to expect that threatening outcome. You're going to expect that negative outcome because it's consistent. You've learned that when that person comes home after work, if they're in a bad mood, there is a physical consequence. So that's like an example of expectancy learning. When you were younger, and maybe this abuse wasn't happening, you would think of the garage door as just a garage door. But now that you've linked the garage door with pain or an expectation of pain, there's a different association with that garage door. So that would be a really good example. I'm going to do some other examples of expectancy learning in class, using funny things like a breakup, a car radio, dates, and menus. So I will be explaining those in class together. If you want to mark this slide, just make sure at this point you understand this concept of expectancy learning, and you could give me an example if you had to. Okay, doing some more background. We are currently on slide 8. So at this point, people tend to get a little bit confused. We just talked about one of our terms, and that term was expectancy learning. So if we stay on slide 8, we now have a new term called evaluative learning. These two things are different because if expectancy learning is about fear, evaluative learning is about disgust. So this is more about being disgusted emotionally. This is not about fear as much. So we're going to give something a negative evaluation, a previously neutral stimulus, something we had no very strong or very positive or negative feeling toward. We are going to link disgust to that thing, and that's going to play into it being a phobia. So you'll see that the little boy who is at the center of the case study, not only is he afraid of buttons, which is based on his expectancy learning, he's also disgusted by buttons, which plays into his evaluative learning. So we need to look toward both of these explanations, expectancy learning and evaluative learning, to figure out what's happening with phobias. We have to target both fear and disgust if we want to cure someone of a phobia long term. Okay, moving on to some citations. We haven't had these before, so this is going to be a little different. So looking at these two citations, they are both going to talk about the importance of fear and disgust and kind of linking those two ideas when it comes to phobias. So please make sure you mark this slide, highlight it in some way. Just know that you need to know both of these citations for your multiple choice quiz for this section. So make sure that for this chapter, you have both Hepburn and Page and De Jong memorized. Now, Hepburn and Page is the first one. It is going to look at adults who have a blood phobia, so a phobia of blood. If we are trying to help those patients, if we treat their disgust and their fear, it helps them make progress in conquering their phobia. So Hepburn and Page just says we have to target both disgust and fear, and if we do so with adults who have a blood phobia, they are going to have better outcomes. If we look at De Jong, this is going to be children who have the phobia of spiders. Now, in this case, we're not going to try to manipulate or lower levels of disgust, but we found concordance or a connection between, we found a correlation that the patient's feelings of disgust declined as their fear declined. So as their fear got lower and lower, if they were quantifying their fear and it went from 100 to 90 to 80 to 70 and so on, so did their level of disgust at the same time. So this shows, even though we weren't actively manipulating feelings of disgust, we see that fear and disgust are linked. And if you don't treat one, if you ignore one, for example, in De Jong, if you are only looking at fear, disgust is naturally linked to it. So they're naturally linked together. You should go after both. You should try to treat both. De Jong is just saying that as one lowers, the other will most likely lower as well. Hepburn and Page is a little bit more targeted in saying that if we treat both, we see better long-term outcomes. Remember the populations for these and the specific phobia. So know that Hepburn and Page is adults with blood, and De Jong is children with spiders. Okay, so moving on with our methodology, this is going to be a case study with one single individual. He is going to be an unnamed 9-year-old boy. We're going to keep his information private, and we're going to keep it as confidential as possible, especially because he is a minor. So we're just going to call him the 9-year-old boy. His history and his treatment are studied in depth, so life history, environmental influences, things like life events, his treatment over time, so we know about all of that. The vast majority of data we're going to collect here is through self-report, so the little boy is going to report what he's thinking and feeling at certain intervals. The mother and the young boy were interviewed about the phobia, how it started, when it started, why it's of buttons. So this young boy had a very scary, what we're going to call activating event, and we'll talk about that. And then he started to have, over time, a slow growing fear of buttons that escalated all the way to a phobia. Just make sure you mark here or circle or highlight where it says minor. He is a minor, so his mother has to give consent for him to be part of this experiment. We're going to have two different measures through self-report, and they're both quantitative, and we're going to have what we call a feelings thermometer, and we're going to have a phobia ladder. So if you look to the right there, that is the feelings thermometer. You might want to label that as feelings thermometer. This is a great way to quantify what a child is thinking or feeling because it's a very intuitive image. Now, the phobia ladder we're going to go into a little bit later. They can also call that a hierarchy of feared stimuli, but you should just call it a phobia ladder. It's a lot simpler. The phobia ladder is based on the activity we're going to do for this section about Oost. So Oost and Elf, the snake. So I'm going to show you guys a video that explains the phobia ladder, how we're going to quantify fear from the lowest level, what we call a 10, to the highest level, which is called 100. And the 100, the most scary, terrible thing that could ever happen to a person, is called the catastrophic belief. So the whole idea here is if you eradicate the person's fear and disgust of the stimuli, and you teach them and show them through experience and learning that the catastrophic belief will not happen, that they're safe, then the phobia goes away. So that's kind of some main ideas here and some methodology. So let's get some basics about our participant and our sample. This is going to be a case study based on a single individual. We can call him the 9-year-old boy. He is Hispanic American, and he was seeking treatment at the Child Anxiety and Phobia Program at FIU in Miami, so actually quite close to us. He had been evaluated by psychologists in that program, and they determined he met the criteria for having a specific phobia of buttons. So this helps us determine that there are no extraneous variables at play. He doesn't have anything else going on. He doesn't have, for example, like PTSD or some kind of abuse or anything. His only issue is a phobia of buttons. Now, he's had this phobia for quite some time in his short life. Even though he's only 9 years old, he's had this phobia for 4 years. So he's had this phobia since the age of 5. Make sure we know that this is a long-term phobia that has been substantiated, studied, and has been confirmed by psychologists. Okay, guys, now moving on. This is going to be an abbreviated version of the procedure. So this is going to be exactly what happens in the experiment, broken down into some very logical steps for you so you understand exactly what's happening at each point. So take a moment, look this slide over, and then I'm going to delve into it. Okay, so the first thing that needs to happen with any experiment is getting consent. So we have informed consent here from two parties, the mother and the actual participant himself, the young 9-year-old boy. So he's a minor, we get consent from both. And then there's an interview to determine if there was any trauma, abuse, anything else that could explain why he had this fear, why he had this phobia. There was not. Third step is the activating event. This is the thing or the situation that leads the young boy to fear buttons, to find them disgusting, and for him to actively avoid them in his everyday life. So what happened to our participant is that when he was young, when he was 5, he knocked down a bowl of buttons in front of his class, and then the class and the teacher laughed at him. So he had a high level of social anxiety attached to this incident of knocking over the basket or the bowl of buttons in front of his class and his teacher. So that is what leads to that distress, that anxiety, that fear is what's going to lead to his avoidance behavior, his avoidance of buttons, and it's going to increase from that point in time. Now, over time, his avoidance is going to increase, and it's going to become very extreme. So much so that in the present day, or when this study was done, he's 9 years old. It interferes significantly in his everyday life. So it's such a major issue that he can't even, for example, button his polo shirt for his school uniform. He can't go to like a Michael's craft store that has buttons in all of the aisles. He can't look at bears that have like cute little buttons on their little fake shirts. So that's how severe it's gotten. He can't dress himself. He becomes preoccupied with buttons and avoiding them every day, dominating his thought patterns. Now at step 4, please mark it, circle it, put a star, something like that. Here's where the quantitative data comes in. The boy is going to create 2 quantitative measures, a specific fear hierarchy, a phobia ladder, and a feelings thermometer. This step is going to show the gradual stepwise motion, how the fear and the disgust grows in the young boy, and what activities he finds most disgusting and fearful, least disgusting and fearful, and we're going to quantify his fears in chunks, progressive chunks. Based on this, we move to step 5. So we found out, based on his creation of these personalized fear thermometers and the personalized phobia ladder, that the thing he fears most, the thing he's most disgusted by and finds the most distressing is handling small, clear plastic buttons or touching someone wearing them. So we have now found, I would mark number 5 in some way, we have now found the young boy's catastrophic belief. Now we move on to step 6. This is going to be treatment number 1. We're going to have multiple treatments for this young person, but the first one we're going to try is a vocabulary word, and that is contingency management. So in contingency management, what's going to happen is we're going to use positive reinforcement. We're going to use kind of Pavlovian, classical conditioning, or just conditioning in general. And when the boy shows less fear as he moves up the phobia ladder, as he does activities that make him more and more stressful or anxious, for example, handling buttons, his mother is going to reward him. So that could be with something like praise or something concrete like a candy or a snack. This is going to be gradual and stepwise, just like the ladder he made and all of the quantitative measures he made. So this is going to happen during structured treatment sessions. So if he, for example, moves up his phobia ladder from a 20 to a 30 to a 30 to a 40, he's going to receive this concrete reward of some kind. Looking to our next slide, slide 14, you just have some visuals here. On the left, you have how you would make a feelings thermometer for a child. And on the right, you have from our text an example of a phobia ladder. Now, I don't like that they use distress ratings of 1 through 8 here. I know that it's somewhat accurate. I just like doing 10 steps because I think they're a little bit more clear. So doing like 10, 20, 30, 40. But that's just showing from distress ratings of 0 to 8. That is the one actually, if you look at it, you're going to have the example that we're going to do together as a class that uses 10 steps. But I would mark or circle this example. It is useful because this is the actual phobia ladder created by the young boy. So if you look at number 1, that's low distress. It's going to be large denim jean buttons. And then if you move all the way up to number 11, small plastic clear buttons are the most fear and distress and disgust, rated as an 8. So this hierarchy is the one that the young boy used or made for himself. So take a moment and look at this slide. We're going to work on 2 vocabulary terms here, in vivo exposure and imagery exposure. I'd like for you guys to think of these as opposites, so contrast them. In vivo exposure is when you do anything in the real world. So if your fear is of spiders, petting a spider is in vivo exposure. If your fear is heights and you go to the top of the Grand Canyon, in vivo exposure. However, if you're going to practice going through the situation only in your head, so imagine closing your eyes, and if you have a fear of heights, imagining that you're at the Grand Canyon looking over, that's going to be what we call imagery exposure. So that's when you imagine a situation, how you would feel, what you'd be thinking, what you would kind of cognitively go through. That's going to be based on your consciousness, and that's imagery exposure, whereas things you actually do in real life that you act upon, touching a spider if that's your phobia, going to the Grand Canyon and looking over the end, those are in vivo exposures. All right, moving on to some more procedure now. We are at step 7, and we are on slide 16. So after we've done treatment number 1, after we've done contingency management, we're going to move on to treatment number 2. After treatment number 1 is fully completed, this is, as I referenced earlier, imagery exposure. So the person is going to use visualization techniques to change how they think and feel. For example, if you've ever heard somebody say, if you're super stressed out, go to your happy place, like go to your Zen spot, make yourself nice and calm and comfortable. That's kind of a version of imagery exposure, so visualizing what you want. Now, earlier in the interview, psychologists found out that the boy, he finds the idea of buttons touching his body very disgusting. So we have disgust being linked to fear here. He thinks buttons smell unpleasant. So to him, there's a definite disgust element happening as well as a fear element. So to treat both of these, to treat, in this case, more of the disgust side, the psychologists are going to ask him to imagine the situations of his fear hierarchy and move up the hierarchy to things that distress him more and more. So move from 10 to 20 to 30 and so on. He's going to visualize these. They're not actually happening in real life. He's just going to imagine them. And then we're going to pair the imagery exposure with self-control therapy. So this is a cognitive behavioral treatment that we're going to go more into in a little bit. So just remember on this slide, I would highlight or mark or write down that imagery exposure is treatment number 2, and it is going to be tied in and combined with self-control therapy. Next, we are going to finish up procedure. So the boy imagines how the buttons look, how they feel, how they smell, and he's going to reflect on how these situations make him feel, how anxious, how fearful, and how disgusted he is. Then he's going to use self-control therapy to acknowledge his feelings and thoughts and consider alternative positive feelings or thoughts. So we're going to go from large buttons to the small clear buttons, which is his highest fear, his catastrophic belief. So for example here, let's say that he's working on his catastrophic belief, number 11 I think it is, that small clear plastic buttons are his worst fear. So what we're going to do is, with this type of self-control therapy and also referencing imagery exposure, we are going to, for example, have him sitting in a chair with his eyes closed. And we're going to say, okay, I know right now you might be feeling anxiety, stress, you might be feeling very uncomfortable. Please imagine the buttons, the small, clear plastic buttons, falling over your body in a waterfall. But I'd like for you to stay calm, cool, and collected. Stay calm and relaxed. Imagine the buttons falling over you. What do they feel like? What do they smell like? What do they look like? You are safe and you are okay. So that's kind of a little mini demo or version of self-control therapy. You acknowledge the thoughts and you replace them with positive thoughts. Moving on to step 8, we're going to collect all the quantitative and qualitative data. Remember, quantitative is going to be based on numbers and scales. So that's going to be the phobia hierarchy, and that's going to be the fear thermometer. And then we have qualitative data, which of course is like, how did the boy behave? What was his emotional state like? When did he become more distressed versus less distressed? What kind of rewards did he ask for from his mother? So all of that would be qualitative. And we found after both of these treatments that the boy's fear of buttons is extremely reduced. So we've done a great job. He has much better long-term outcomes, and he's going to have a much more functional life now that he's gotten over this phobia. So moving on to step 9, the final step in procedure. It's very important to do a long-term follow-up to see how long these results are going to last. So just because he's better now, we want to make sure he's better long-term for the rest of his life, and we have a very good positive result that's sticking. So to make sure, we did a 6-month and 12-month follow-up, and during both of those follow-ups, the boy reports minimal feelings of distress about buttons. He no longer meets the diagnostic criteria for a specific phobia of buttons. His feelings toward buttons are no longer affecting his normal life and functioning. And he could even wear shirts with the small, clear plastic buttons you would find, for example, on a school uniform, and he has no issues. So he's made a lot of progress, it's fantastic, and he no longer has this very unique and odd phobia of buttons. So, taking a moment to look at our results and data. Let's reference treatment number 1, contingency management. You can also call that positive reinforcement therapy. So those are synonyms. But if you want to keep it simple, you could just call it contingency management. So the young boy did a fantastic job. He successfully completes all the steps of his fear hierarchy. He approaches buttons more positively after the experiment. He can physically touch them, handle them. He shows this during his sessions, that he's more comfortable with buttons. His subjective rankings of distress increase between sessions 2 and 3. So the idea here is that even though he's had more sessions, growth is not always linear. You can become more anxious, less anxious. Growth is not going to be a perfect bell curve or like a perfect growth consistently over time. Some sessions go better than others. By session 4, however, a number of items of the fear hierarchy increase in score, as we said. He is going to feel more fear. There's a typo there. It says with them, but it should be with them. Fear, anxiety, and disgust. So this increase is normal just because, as I said, all progress is not linear and perfect. You can have a spike sometimes because you're moving up the fear hierarchy, so it's okay that we see this spike. But overall, we see him move through all the steps of the fear hierarchy. He completes all of them. He does a fantastic job, so this is okay. If we look at treatment number 2, which is the imagery exposure therapy, he is successful in reducing his distress over time. So he may have rated things an 8 or a 5 or a 3. So if I had a certain stimuli, like touching clear buttons, and that was an 8, over time it's going to move down to being less disgusting. So it's going to be going from a 8 to a 5 to a 3, moving downward. So he's getting less fear and less disgust from the same stimuli. So even though, he's touching the same thing he touched before, he has had this exposure where he has imagined touching it, imagined smelling it, imagined feeling it, and that's made him more comfortable with touching the real thing in real life. All right, so looking at our 2 main conclusions, we're almost done here. They are very important, so make sure you know them for the quiz. The first one is that emotions and cognitions relating to disgust are important when learning new responses to phobic stimuli. So in order to reprogram the mind, in order for someone to view what they thought before was a scary, unpleasant, fearful, disgusting thing, and changing that person's perception about that thing, we have to target disgust. We have to make sure disgust is part of the equation. Now, conclusion number 2 says imagery exposure can have a long-term positive effect, reducing distress associated with specific phobias. So this is more about fear. So when using imagery exposure, you're going to have long-term positive outcomes for case study patients who have a specific phobia. It helps them confront their negative evaluations of that stimuli, understanding that it's not disgusting, it's not scary or fear-based, it's not dangerous. So that's what we have for both of our conclusions here. Remember the difference between disgust and fear always. Okay guys, we're almost through. Let's do our strengths and weaknesses. They're going to be on every single study. The strengths are that it's a highly valid study. The participant was studied over a long period of time using several different methods of data collection. We talked about both of those main ones. So I would write next to this fear thermometer and phobia hierarchy. Oh, actually, silly me, they're right beneath it. So I would just highlight, sorry, I got ahead of myself. I would just highlight those two. I would highlight fear hierarchy and I would highlight feeling thermometer. And then we have quantitative and qualitative data both collected. So we're able to see the improvement session after session. We're able to see how the individual has his fear reduced, his disgust reduced. So we can measure his growth. We have a lot of meaningful background data that's incredibly important. It's very useful. So we know that the child actually has a specific phobia. He's not, for example, reacting to abuse or PTSD or anything else. We want to make sure his abnormal behavior is based on a phobia. And to do that, we need a lot of background info about his life experiences, his environment, and that's all qualitative data. Moving on to weaknesses here, there are quite a few. So of course, if it's one person, this is going to be an incredibly small sample. Everything was specific to him. So he made his own fear thermometer. He made his own phobia hierarchy. So everything's specific to him. It's a very, very rare phobia. So it's not like fear of dogs or fear of blood, fear of closed spaces, fear of heights. Those are very common phobias. So if it was a more common phobia, we could use that data and apply it to more people. But it's very rare. I've never heard of anyone else besides this young person who's had a phobia of buttons. So we can't really generalize that in any way. As I said, it's subjective. Everything he had for quantitative data, he made himself. So he made his phobia hierarchy, he made his fear thermometer, he made all of that on his own. Everything is highly individualized. It's made just for him. Oh, the example here on the right, I think is quite funny. It's an example of what it means to be subjective. So of course, just to remind you, subjective preferences are based on personal beliefs, thoughts, and feelings. They're not objective. So a subjective preference is, for example, you can see on the picture, she's really enjoying the strawberry cake, and he seems quite disgusted by it. So subjective just meaning that one person may have a different opinion than another person. Okay, building on to some more of our weaknesses. Of course, there could be an issue of bias here. A case study is based on building a relationship with your participant or your small group of participants. That means you have to have a certain level of closeness and intimacy, discussion, understanding, consent. So all of this may lead to a higher risk of bias and a lack of the experimenter being objective, keeping himself separate from everything happening, or a lack of privacy, sharing information they should not share. So that could be a very specific issue of case studies. Now, of course, we always have to be aware of demand characteristics. The participant is going to be in a high anxiety or high stress situation, and he is a young person. So he may fall into demand characteristics to, for example, please his mother who's in the room, please the experimenter, say that he feels better, like, oh, I'm definitely less scared, or I have less fear, or I have less disgust, but they may not actually be true because he knows what outcome they want. He knows that the experimenter and his mother want him to get better, and to not have this fear or phobia anymore. So he knows what is wanted by them. He knows what is expected of him. And he could have kind of inflated his scores based on self-report data that was biased and had fallen into demand characteristics. All right, almost done, guys. Ethically, we have a very, very strong study here, so this is excellent. If we look at Saavedra and Silverman, we have the young boy and his mother both giving consent, so that's fantastic. He was being exposed to stress, so this consent form is very, very important. For him to conquer this phobia and have a better quality of life, he had to consent at every point to go forward. So his rights are being respected. The fact that he shouldn't be mentally, physically, or emotionally harmed, all of that is being respected. He's given consent, and he's being treated well as the participant. Now, of course, this kind of treatment, because it can be very stressful, is going to have pros and cons. So all of those were discussed with the boy and his mother every step of the way. Of course, the two of them agree to move forward because they want to improve his quality of life, as I've said. One thing that was very important to the boy was to remain anonymous, so rightfully preserving his privacy. It's incredibly important, especially because he's a minor. So I would highlight or star here, essential and incredibly important when working with minors. Remember, he is age 9 when this is happening. And last slide, everybody. We are currently on slide 25. Let's look at our big 5 issues. So application to everyday life. Phobias are actually increasingly common. It is a very distressing mental health condition, which a lot of people can have, and it can affect their everyday life in a lot of ways. It might make them feel more anxious, more stressed, more insecure. So we should see and do whatever we can to encourage potential long-term improvements or more positive outcomes for patients who have severe, intense phobias. If we look at nature versus nurture, nurture is going to dominate what we know about phobias, because a lot of people will say that it is based on life experiences. Like, for example, if I was bitten by a snake when I was a kid, that could play into me having a phobia now. So nurture is really at the core of this, not so much genetics or anything. As I've said, and as it says here, phobias are not considered innate or genetically inherited. So it's not like if my mom had a phobia of snakes, it's in her DNA. It's not going to pass down in the chromosomes or anything like that. Now, nurture-wise, if I grow up with a parent who has a fear of snakes and I constantly hear that over and over, I might grow up to have a fear or phobia of them too. But once again, that's nurture, not nature. As it says, phobias are considered products of negative experiences based on reinforcement and based on classical conditioning. And of course, last but not least, use of children in psychological research. The participant is a 9-year-old boy. All the extra protocols for working with children are being followed. Remember, children are what we call a protected group. So children, the elderly, and inmates, people in prisons. So animals, we have special groups we have to take extra precaution to take care of. And in this case, we did all of that. Okay, everybody, we made it. We are now at the end of the PowerPoint for our chapter for Saavedra and Silverman. Now, as I've said, you are not going to have PowerPoint questions for this chapter because you're going to have a multiple choice quiz. So I've given you exactly what you need to know for this quiz. I've used very specific terms for how much you need to know. So in-depth, complete, definitions like expectancy learning for number 5. Basics of something, definitions of something as written. So I've given you some very specific information as to what you need for this quiz. Of course, pay attention to anything in capitals, in caps, in bold. And that's it, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening. Oh, and I included some cute little memes here. I thought you guys would like those. You know I like to share my memes. So I love the classical conditioning, like hair conditioner example. And then the one with the dogs is actually pretty thought-provoking. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me during class. You can ask me during lunchtime. You can always shoot me an email, and I'm here if you guys need anything at all. So once again, thank you so much. And this is Miss Mokwa at Wellington Community High School, AICE Psychology Program, AS level, Syllabus 9990. Thank you so much, and have a nice evening.